All right, our final unit is monetary policy, which is the Federal Reserve Bank's manipulation of the money supply to achieve certain economic goals. But before we understand monetary policy, we have to understand banking, because the Fed uses the banking system to do this. Before we understand banking, we have to know what money is. So we're going to talk about money and banking. All right, money has three functions. This is very important. First is it's a medium of exchange. You use it to buy stuff. That's its main function. But that's profound. That's important. It allows us to escape the complications of barter. I don't have to figure out what I can give you in exchange for your cow and then figure out what I have to bargain with someone else to butcher the cow for me. I can just teach. Remember comparative advantage and specialization. I can specialize in teaching and use my money from that to buy everything else I need. I can only do that, though, because we have this paper medium of exchange. Secondly, money is a unit of account. It's a yardstick for measuring the relative worth of goods and services. If I say it's used for comparison purposes, if you ask me, what does my house cost? And I say it costs $30,000. And you ask another person, they say, they say $900,000. Well, you picture two very if it's a house in the immediate area we're in right now, you picture two very different houses. $900,000, you picture a nice McMansion in the preserve. $30,000, you picture a shack in Bessemer. So it's a yardstick for relative value. Third function, it's a store of value. You can take $100 and put it under your mattress, and a year from now you can pull that $100 out and still buy stuff with it. So it enables you to transfer your purchasing power to the future from the present. It's a store of value. Now, the amount of money out there is not as straightforward a calculation as you would suspect. Again, there is another army of economists that figure out how much money is circulating out there. And they have several definitions. The narrowest definition of money is called M1. You'll see this a lot in the press. So it's part of your economic literacy. M1 is only two things: currency, actual paper money and coins, and checkable deposits, meaning the balances in your checking accounts. So currency and checkable deposits. Currency obviously is acceptable for buying things, but you can also write a check or use your debit card. And so that balance in your checking account also makes sense as money. So this is the narrowest definition of money: currency plus checkable deposits. Next definition of money that the Army of Economists keep track of is M2. It's a broader definition, so it includes all of M1 plus three other things. First of all, savings accounts. Many of you probably have a savings account, and you can rather easily on the computer, in an ATM perhaps, or certainly in the bank, transfer money from your savings account to your checking account or withdraw it from the ATM, in which case it's pretty spendable, pretty easy to get to, and so we include that. Also something called money market accounts, which is sort of a restricted checking account that pays you interest. Two, small time deposits, certificates of deposit, CDs. You deposit those with the bank. You agree to leave them for a certain amount of time. But you can get them out. You can pay a little penalty and get them out early if you want to. And so this can be transferred into spendable cash pretty easily. So anything under $100,000, any certificate of deposit under $100,000, we include in M2. And finally, money market mutual funds. Let's say you invest your money in an investment fund, a pool issued by, let's say, Charles Schwab, and it invests in treasury bills. And they may even let you write checks on it. So it's pretty easy to get to, and so we're going to include that in the M2 definition as well. So these three things plus M1 equals M2. From where does money derive its value? If I offer you $1, you'll take it, but it's just a piece of paper. Why is it worth $1? Well, several reasons. Number one, acceptability. Currency and checks are money because people accept them as such. People have confidence in the currency. Maybe it's a lie that $1 is worth $1, but it's a lie to which we've all bought into. Secondly, it's legal tender. It says it on the money. Take out your money and look at it. It's a legal tender. It's usable for all debts, public and private. The government has said so. And the U.S. government is the most powerful entity in the world, and if it says it's worth $1, well, that means something, right? So legal tender, it's by fiat. Fiat money refers to money that is worth $1 because the government has declared it by fiat to be worth something. It's legal tender. Number 3, money is like anything else. It depends on supply and demand, and it derives value from its scarcity relative to its utility. We all want money, and there's a fixed amount of it. That gives it value. All right, let's talk about money and prices. Don't worry about this formula here. It just illustrates the fact that the purchasing power of $1 varies inversely with the price level. If the price of a foot-long Subway sandwich increases from $5 to $10, clearly money must be worth half as much. Or if we double the amount of money, clearly each individual piece of money is worth half as much, and therefore Subway will want $10, not $5 for the sandwich. There's an inverse relationship between the prices and the value of money. Inflation is bad. When a government issues more and more currency to solve its problems, and there's a strong tendency to do this, 2 things result. 1, inflation may significantly depreciate the value of money between the time it is received and the time it is spent. In hyperinflationary environments, you literally take your money and run once you're paid to the store to spend it before the prices go up. You'll recall the 3rd function of money was as a store of value. So inflation very much can destroy that function of money. 2, sellers will not know what to charge and buyers will not know what to pay. Let's say you're in a hyperinflationary environment, like in Zimbabwe, and you go and buy a steak, and it's $100,000 Zimbabwean dollars, and you think, well, last week this was $10,000. How much am I really spending? You begin to get confused, and so money's function as a yardstick of value is also destroyed. If it gets bad enough, short of government force, people will stop taking the currency, and so the main function of money as a medium of exchange is destroyed. So inflation is a bad thing. It must be regulated somehow. In America, inflation is regulated by a central bank called the Federal Reserve Bank. And to give you some historical background, we didn't have one after the 1830s, and Congress decided in the very early 20th century that the U.S. banking system needed some centralization and public regulation to be more efficient. It was decentralized. It was completely unregulated. Banks could do whatever they wanted to. And different separate private banks issued their own banknotes. There were lots of kinds of money actually circulating around. And it was very mismanaged. Sometimes there was too little money in the economy. Sometimes there was too much. Deflation and inflation reigned whenever they wanted to. There was a major financial panic, 1907, the Panic of 1907. It was brief but severe, and it was resolved by the machinations of John Pierpont Morgan, a private banker who arranged a bailout for the nation. And Congress said, we need to look at this. We shouldn't be relying on a private individual. And they created something called the National Monetary Commission to study the banking system and outline a course of action. And it was a good commission. The results were some recommendations that were crafted into the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, signed by Woodrow Wilson, which established the Federal Reserve System, which is commonly called the Fed. Now listen carefully. Here's how the Fed is organized. The president appoints a board of governors to run it, 7 people. He appoints them, and they serve 14-year terms, but they're staggered every 2 years, so one of them rolls off. So therefore, we have a lot of continuity and solidity on the board. It also insulates the board as much as possible from politics. This is sort of like the Supreme Court, except that they're appointed for life. Yes, they're appointed by political figures, but once appointed, they're sort of out of the reach of the scope of politics, and we want control of the money supply out of the reach of politics. The president, among the 7 governors, picks 2, one of whom he elevates to the position of chairman and the other as vice chairman. And during their tenure as governor, they serve in these capacities for 4-year terms. They most often have been extended, in one case to the point of 20 years. So these are long-serving people. Now, the Board of Governors manages not a bank, but a system of banks. The Federal Reserve System is a system of 12 regional banks. The banks are quasi-public. Theoretically, they're owned, they're run by this public entity appointed by the president, but they're privately owned because when the system was started, let's say in San Francisco, would say, all right, Bank of America, you're going to put up $10 million, and Bank of Italy, small bank in San Francisco, you're going to put up $5 million. And so really the private banks theoretically own the Federal Reserve regional banks and appoint their presidents. So, but it's managed by a public entity, the Board of Governors. So it's quasi-public private. It's a clever invention. It serves as a banker's bank. You can't open an account at the Fed, but banks are the people who loan money from the Fed and who deposit their money in the Fed. The most important committee in the Fed is something called the Federal Open Market Committee. We'll talk more about that phrase, open market, later. But the FOMC, this is a policy committee which sets monetary policy. And when I say set monetary policy, it decides whether to raise or lower the amount of money in the economy. And you'll quickly learn that also means they're raising and lowering interest rates. The FOMC is composed of 12 members. Among them, all 7 members of the Board of Governors, including the chairman and the vice chairman. The president of the New York Fed, regional Fed, he's always on it. Why? Because that's the most important one, and because the New York Fed is instrumental in conducting the operations with which the Fed raises and lowers the money supply. More about that later. And the other 4 members, that's 8, the other 4 members are the other 11 Fed presidents who serve on a one-year rotating basis. Right now, for example, I believe the president of the Richmond Fed is on the FOMC, which meets approximately every 6 weeks or so. So what does the Fed do? Well, first of all, it now issues all U.S. currency. If you pull out a bill, you'll notice at the top it says Federal Reserve Note. It sets reserve requirements, and it holds reserves. It says to a bank, for example, you have to keep 10% of your deposits in reserve. You can't loan them all out. And you'll keep that with us, by the way. You'll deposit that money here at the Fed. It lends money to banks when they need it. It provides for check collection. If you bank at Regions and you write a check to your friend who banks at Wachovia, how does Wachovia get the money? Well, the Fed helps provide a system to do that. 5, it acts as a fiscal agent. Fiscal means financial in relation to a government. Specifically, it acts as the fiscal agent of the U.S. federal government. The only people that can have accounts at the Fed or other banks or the U.S. federal government. Their checking account is at the Fed. 6, it supervises banks, telling them, for example, what their lending standards should be. And 7, and most important by far, which is why I put it in red, it controls the money supply. The Fed is awesomely powerful. It can raise and lower the money supply with no more than an agreement of that 12-member board, regardless of what Congress or the President says. How it does that, we need to understand a little bit more about banking, and that's what we're going to talk about next time. Okay, we want to spend a few minutes learning about how a bank's balance sheet is set up, how banks are internally constructed, because we need to know that to understand how the Fed manipulates the money supply. Let's pretend that we were going to start a rental house business and the house cost $100,000. A balance sheet lists on the left assets, and our asset would be our $100,000 house. On the right, it lists liabilities and equity. It lists the claims on those assets. And so we're going to put down $10,000 and we're going to get a mortgage loan for the rest for $90,000. $90,000 are our liabilities, $10,000 are our equity or our net worth, the amount of the $100,000 that we claim. We're going to apply this model to banking. All right, we're going to open a bank and we're going to get investors to invest $250,000. They're going to own the bank, and so their investment is worth $250,000. Stock shares, that's also another form of equity. And our assets are going to be, right now, just $250,000 in cash. Notice that each side equals the same amount. The assets have to equal the amount of the claims on the assets. That's why we call this a balance sheet. Now we're going to invest some of that $250,000 in cash. We're going to build a little bank or buy a trailer. We're going to buy some equipment. And at the end of that initial phase, we're going to have spent all but $10,000 in the cash. Notice that our assets are still $250,000. We value the property at what we paid for it. And over here, of course, we have no liabilities yet. We're still all equity, all net worth at $250,000. Now we need some deposits, and so we get customers to come in, and they bring in $100,000 in deposits in checking accounts, and of course that money is reflected in an increased amount of cash. So after our first day of business, we have $350,000 in assets, and we owe our depositors $100,000. That's a liability, and we still have $250,000 in net worth. So we have, of course, $350,000 in liabilities and net worth. So we still equal. Our next step is to make some loans to have assets that will earn us interest. But first we have to figure out how much of this deposit base can we loan out, and how much must we keep in reserve. There are requirements about this. That's what fractional reserve banking means. Now these are actual reserve requirements. For these smaller amounts of deposits, this doesn't look small, but trust me, it is. We have to keep a fairly low amount, but for anything over about $50 million, we have to keep 10% in reserve. So for all practical purposes, since most banks in America are well above $48 million in deposits, the real reserve requirement is about 10%. That may sound low to you, I don't know. But for our fictional example, we're going to use a 20% reserve requirement. Now, notice that our cash has gone to zero, and we have sent all of our cash of $110,000 to the Fed. The Fed is a banker's bank. We deposit our money there. We call it reserves on our balance sheet. And we have $100,000 in deposits. We need some loans. How much in loans can we make? Well, we have to keep 20% of $100,000, and that, of course, is $20,000. We have, however, over here, $110,000, so we have $90,000 extra. That's how much in new loans we can make. But before we can make any new loans, one of our customers writes a check for $50,000, takes our deposits down from 100 to 50. Wherever that check ends up, whatever bank it ends up in, they send it to the Fed. The Fed said, oh yeah, we'll credit you from Bank of Wendell's reserves, and our reserves go from 110 to 60. We now appear to be about 300 on each side, still, of course, balancing. And we still can make loans. We have $50,000 in deposits. That means we have to keep 20% of that is 10. We have to keep 10 in reserves. We still have $50,000 in excess reserves, so we can still make a $50,000 loan. We find a credit-worthy customer, and he wants a business loan, and so we give him a business loan of $50,000. And notice that now we have a new category over here, loans, and that's exciting because we have an asset that is earning us interest. That's the purpose of banking. Notice that we just added a loan category over here and put the money in a checking account for him. So our deposits went up by $50,000. Now notice what happened here. We invented money. We just did an entry on a balance sheet on each side to make it balanced. We didn't actually go dig up gold, but by increasing checkable deposits in money that he can go spend, we have created money. When banks make loans, they create money. Just like the goldsmith created money when he wrote a gold certificate for gold that he didn't have. Money was still spendable. Now our customer made that loan to spend it on something, equipment or whatever, and so he does, and our deposits go down. He spends the $50,000, so our deposits go back down to 50. That check clears through the Fed, and our reserves go from 60 to 10. That's exactly how much in reserves we have to have, 20% of 50. So we now have 0 excess reserves. We want to make more loans, but first we've got to go get more deposits. So we market ourselves and try and get more deposits, and we do. We take our deposits up another 50, from 50 to 100. Now we've got an extra $50,000 in excess reserves that we can go make a loan. And we want to do that. Loans are very lucrative. The problem is we can't find a credit-worthy customer. And so we decide, well, we want to make a little bit of money with this excess reserves of $50,000. Let's at least buy a bond. So we buy, say, a U.S. Treasury bond. And now we have another interest-earning asset over here on our asset side. They don't earn as much interest as loans. We prefer a loan, but if we can't find one that we know is going to be paid back, we'll at least earn some money by investing in bonds. And this is basically how banks make money. They'll keep getting deposits, and they will use those to preferably make loans, or if not, buy bonds. And the money they earn on the bonds and loans generally exceeds what they have to pay in expenses and on interest to depositors, and it's very lucrative.